Good morning from Glasgow, and welcome to this session that will go from the cosmic space data right down to the local granularity of adaptation and resilience in developing countries and small island states. So we really have a huge spectrum to discuss in this meeting, and I think we'll find it extremely interesting to understand how we are able to capture information using the latest technologies, but make sure that that is translated into climate finance at the most locally level possible. So it really is, if you like, a cosmic ecosystem for resilience that we are building, and you will hear about in this meeting. Please allow me briefly to introduce myself and the participants, and then we will go to the keynote speaker. So I am David Jackson, Director of Local Transformative Finance at the UN's Capital Development Fund, and I'm very pleased to announce on the panel we have Dr. Einar Bjørgo, who is the director of the UN Satellite Center, UNOSAT, at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, known as UNITAR. We have online Ms. Fruzsina Straus from UN Habitat, who is the Program Management Officer and Project Manager for the City Resilience Action Planning Tool. We have here with us Ms. Loretta Heiber-Girardet, who is the Chief Risk Officer of the Knowledge Branch of the UNDRR, which deals with disaster risk reduction. And finally, we have Mr. Alpha Jallo, who is the Director of the Climate Secretariat in the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Natural Resources from the Gambia. However, most importantly, we are privileged to have with us our keynote speaker, Her Excellency Nancy Tembo, who is the Minister for Forestry and Natural Resources from Malawi, one of the countries that will benefit from this mechanism that we're going to talk about today. We're delighted that you managed to find time to join us, Nancy, and the floor is yours for your keynote speech.
Good morning, Master of Ceremony. Good morning, colleagues, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am Minister of Forestry and Natural Resources in Malawi. As Minister of Forestry and Natural Resources, I have the pleasure and sometimes the headache of regularly traveling the length and breadth of my country. Pleasure because of those of you who know the hills and lakeside towns and villages of my country. Malawi is a beautiful country with a rich history and vibrant culture. But my travels can be a source of heartache too, because as the years go by, and with each journey I make, I'm confronted by the impact of our changing climate. The rains are not as predictable as they once were. The natural rhythms that guide farmers, that help them to decide when to plant and how to tend their fields, have been eroded. Farmers are struggling with shorter growing seasons, more pestilence and falling yields. Flooding, drought, and unpredictable weather patterns are the new normal. So it's very exciting for me today to be part of a session that is looking for solutions. As technologies that offer potential to bring some sense to the changes we're experiencing in Malawi and for the LDCs and vulnerable nations such as SIDS on the climate change front line. With access to information, Malawi and other nations challenged by the dual burden of poverty and climate collapse can be empowered to deal with the new normal and to plan for it. Because even if, by some miracle, we keep to 1.5 degrees of warming, our climate in Malawi and many other tropical nations have already been irreversibly changed for generations to come. We need to adapt. And to do that, we need more climate finance for Malawi, LDCs, SIDS, and other vulnerable nations. And we have to ensure that funds are spent wisely and effectively, not based on our understanding of the past, but on projections that are forward-looking and rooted in data analysis. Malawi will employ innovative climate finance mechanisms and sources, including the local mechanism, to incentivize continuous improvement in climate change responses at the subnational and grassroots level where action is most needed. Malawi will use the local facility support to cover the additional costs of adaptation and channel resources to local governments to enhance local resilience and accelerate action through the local level in alignment with the LDC 2050 vision. Our towns and cities, our homes, schools, and methods of transport need to be rethought, redesigned, and improved. Our investments and planning must be informed by our new climate reality. Governments at all levels, including local government level, have to be included in the adaptation process. And finance needs to be channeled to communities for action using existing national systems. Adaptation solutions with greater chances of achieving impact at a scale are those grounded on solid and science-based evidence. We need to ensure that all nations, including LDCs, are able to use satellite-based Earth observation data, that we are equipped with participatory planning tools, and that we can build on country-based finance mechanisms such as the local mechanism that are aligned with country systems as well as the Paris Agreement. With no further ado, I pass the floor now to other speakers, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much indeed, Your Excellency. I think that you are passionate about this issue of adaptation, and you pointed out quite rightly that 1.5 degrees irreversible change happens, and to some extent, it has already happened. I think one of the things that we are experiencing at this COP is finally people are waking up to the fact that climate change is not something in the future tense. It's not even something in the present tense, it's actually also in the past tense. It is happening and has happened as well as will happen. And that means that whilst it's great that we can discuss various initiatives to reduce emissions, whatever happens, we need to adapt now and even yesterday. And this is what is lagging in the debate, it's what's lagging in the mechanisms, because we don't yet have at scale ways to identify what needs to be done, to get the resources down there and make sure that it is done, because adaptation is inherently local. It's about local ecosystems, local economies, local soil, local buildings, the built environment, the farmers. It's a local thing, and you only need to go a few kilometers or miles and the adaptive response changes. It's also largely about water, land use planning, agriculture, urbanization, things that are dealt with at the local level. So how to get from the local level to the cosmic level? We have Dr. Einar Bjørgo, who is the director of the UN Satellite Center. So I would like to kind of zoom right out and get ourselves right up there and ask you, what are the benefits of using satellite data combined with geospatial information technology when it comes to evidence-based decision-making for sustainable development? And what are the linkages with improved climate resilience for vulnerable small states? And I think we'll want to take what you say and then see how we can then apply it, not in the general, but in the specific, because that information is only useful if somebody somewhere can actually translate it into their daily reality. And I hope that that's what we can kind of bridge that gap today in this meeting. So over to you.
Thank you so much. When it comes to satellite imagery, I think it's one of the few information sources that is really serving as a cross-cutting data source for the Sustainable Development Agenda. The same satellite imagery can be used to derive information of such as changes in land use, health of agricultural areas, flood assessments, deforestation, and even coming up with data on the melting sea ice. Recently, my team in Vanuatu, together with UNDP, developed a nice project where they basically mapped out all the households in order to prepare for election monitoring. So just to show the wide range of the sources you can use when it comes to sustainable development. However, informed decision-making needs objective and timely information. It also needs information provided in a manner that decision makers can understand. I think speaking from my perspective, in the past, at least the space community has failed in providing this information because we've been providing users with satellite imagery, and it's not what they need. They need information. However, the information must come from objective, science-based sources, and this is also what satellite imagery is all about. Satellite imagery is objective, it can be timely provided, and you can also time travel if you like. You can go back in time to see what was the situation many years ago, going all the way back to about 40 years ago. However, what I've seen also in the COVID situation is something that has been quite revealing because, of course, as an expert, I know that you can get this information from anywhere on the planet. However, what is really nice to see now is that a lot of people are starting to realize that. Because before you would go to the place, but thanks to COVID, or because of COVID, not thanks to it, but because to COVID, we can contribute with this information in order to leave no one behind, because you can get information from far away communities. So I'm very glad to see that that has become one of the main realizations following the COVID pandemic. However, I would also like to say that satellite imagery-derived information is at its best when combined with other data. Again, providing the images by themselves can be useful, but it's really when you combine it with other data, such as population distribution, to see, for example, how many people are currently inside a flooded area. What is the distance from a village to the nearest school or a hospital? This directly impacts access to education and health services. You can get this information by combining such information. Another example is something interesting we do with the Arab Bank for Economic Development called BADEA. Here we are using the satellite tools in order to monitor the progress on their development projects. So for example, look in Africa, how road construction projects are advancing. We are using this, providing them with satellite images in a very cost-effective manner, because before they would have to go there and see for themselves what was the situation. Now they can use satellite images. When it comes to the linkages with improved climate resilience for small states, I followed many discussions here during the COP, and I think what we have seen, and the statistics shows that only 3% of the acceptable global available climate finance has been really provided to small island development states. So why is that? And when I listen to the ministers, well, one explanation is the lack of data providing information of the impact of climate change at the local level and where people live. And I think this is really where we can provide good information using this type of technologies. And this information is required when you apply to climate change, climate adaptation proposal. If you don't have it, basically your product is not going to get funded. So I think this is something that we have made moderately, I would say, successful in what we call the common sensing solution, because this is a product that is still going on. We have developed this in partnership with the governments of Fiji, Vanuatu, and the Solomon Islands. Here we help in their efforts to build resilience to the devastating impact of climate change in their countries and improving access to climate finance. So this initiative has been supported by the UK Space Agency International Partnership Programme and also includes the Commonwealth Secretariat and Satellite Applications Catapult, as well as other UK partners. And from our side, we have developed several solutions that are quite useful. And I want to highlight that this has been done in collaboration with the government partners. It's not something that we come up with, but it's really by being there together with them. One tool is basically to what we call descriptive analytics. So this describes, the descriptive analytics presents the informed risk index, you may know this, at the subnational level, where users can easily recognize the relative risk of different administrative units. Taking it one step further, we are able to use a diagnostic tool to break down the informed risk index into exposure to hazard, vulnerability, and lack of coping capacity for selected subnational levels, again going down to the local level, and again combining this with other data sources. Now, again, to look at the needs at the local level, especially when it comes to specific adaptation to climate change, we have developed the multiple criteria decision analytic tool, which allows decision makers to find optimal disaster reduction measures based on multiple factors. Such tools can, for example, be used if you have to move a village where coastal communities, they can no longer live there. And I was very pleased working with the government of Fiji when we went there and we were able to go to the local communities all out by the coast and speaking to the elders and understanding that, of course, this is the worst case scenario because they want to live there, they want to continue living there. And if they have to move in a place where we can make sure that they are well protected. However, this was, of course, be done in a very consultative way with these communities. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much indeed. You know, I think you answered the follow-up question I was going to ask you to some degree, which was about where has this been used in terms of finance to make decisions. Now, I think what we'll need to think about, and we can come back to this in the open discussion after the speakers, is how we can then take this to scale through an approach through systems and mechanisms. Currently, there are a number of projects out there, like one single project that has access to this kind of data, but that's not going to be enough. There has to be a way to plug this approach into global mechanisms, global systems, so that it's part of the way of doing business and the data is made available in that way. And so what we can look at, explore later, is through the local climate adaptive living facility, for example, where there are 27 countries. How you can plug that in to those 27 countries, bringing Fiji with you and Vanuatu, so that would, and the Solomon Islands, in fact, that would then make it 30 countries. And then we're starting to get to scale. Because there is a local planning methodology, and you have the data that should inform that. And that planning methodology is associated with a financing methodology. So I think that's a great way to turn now to the next speaker, and then we can circle back, I think, in the discussion and join up the dots. And the next speaker is Fruzsina Straus, the UN Habitat Program Management Officer and Project Manager of the City Resilience Action Planning Tool. So Fruzsina, you've just heard about this information that is out there. And I'm going to ask you why participatory planning and community involvement is important for climate adaptation and resilience building in urban areas. But of course, it is important. So can you share some examples with us about that? But can you also just reflect a little bit on what you've just heard and how that could be potentially plugged in to the participatory planning that you are involved with? Over to you, Fruzsina. Online.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Well, hello to Glasgow and to the online world. It's really great to be here, even if only virtually, and to be part of this One UN event. It was very interesting to listen to the previous speaker It may seem like a discussion on participation is a departure from a discussion on data, but in fact, the two are actually intricately linked. I will come back to this a little bit when I talk about how participation can give us micro data, local level data that is very nuanced, and how it can reveal different layers of the climate challenge. But I would like to start by, to actually start my answer by putting this issue in the context of the COP26 negotiations. So the implementation of the Paris Agreement and NDCs really gets critical at the localization level, especially in the case of the LDCs and the SIDS. This localization in cities can only happen with the participation of municipalities, communities, and all urban stakeholders. And I will explain a bit on how and why. So I would like to zoom in on Africa. I work for the Africa Regional Office of UN Habitat, so it's my geographic area of focus. And talk a little bit about resilience planning and to bring a few examples of a tool, the CityRAP tool that you had mentioned I work on, and how it's been used by UN Habitat across the continent. So the CityRAP tool, I mean, we use the word tool, but I'd like to explain a bit that when we say tool, we mean really more of a methodology or approach or process for facilitating participatory resilience planning in secondary cities. We're focusing it on small to intermediate sized cities in sub-Saharan Africa. So this CityRAP tool or process, it enables communities to identify and to prioritize critical resilience issues and to plan actions and responses. And all of this is captured in what we call a resilience framework for action. The methodology or process entails a series of activities that are implemented by the leadership of the municipality, and it takes about 3 to 5 months. So UN Habitat has already implemented this CityRAP tool in over 30 cities across Africa. So we've gathered a lot of interesting experiences and data from those implementations. So I would just like to give a few quick examples from the CityRAP implementations on how tools like this can help to localize the climate agenda and to provide data and information that helps integrate climate action into broader resilience building. So I'm going to give 3 quick examples, one from Zambia, one from Malawi, and one from Madagascar.
Temporarily lost you. Yes, we've lost you again. So maybe we'll just wait, let's say, 15 seconds. If you don't come back, Fruzsina, we're going to jump, I think, to the next speaker. Let's do that now. So we'll jump to the next speaker and hold that thought, because I'm sure we'll get you back soon. And I'd like now to turn the floor to Loretta Hiba Girardet, who is the Chief of the Risk Knowledge Branch at UNDRR, which stands for Disaster Risk Reduction. And your institution has just completed 10 years of the Making Cities Resilient campaign. Now, it would be very interesting to share some of the key lessons from that campaign, and also from the perspective of data and partnerships. And in fact, you know, as we know with climate change, one of the things that is happening is there is a noticeable increase in the energy in the atmosphere, therefore a noticeable increase in the number of weather-related natural disasters. And Making Cities Resilient is going to have a very busy next 10 years, whatever happens. So how can what are your inputs to this discussion so far, based on what you've heard?
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And unfortunately, as you've just pointed out, disasters are a growth business, especially in cities, because very often cities is where you have a large amount of exposure, and so therefore they are, you know, very much on the front line. So UNDRR has been working with a group of partners, including UN Habitat, by the way. So we'll be able to go back in a few moments, I hope, to hear from our UN Habitat colleague. But it really tackles one of the issues that you've just mentioned, and it is the need to go to scale. No single agency by itself can provide the type of technical and assistance and support to the many, many hundreds, if not thousands of cities that need to develop resilience strategies and need to implement them. And the first 10 years of this program was really more of a sensitization campaign, where we got cities more aware of, I would say, of the need to start thinking about resilience. But in that time frame of 10 years, even though we weren't really focused on implementation, we did learn some very key lessons. And one of the first lessons is that cities are very keen to learn from each other. The experiences that they are having are very valuable for other cities. So if I just take the example of Makati in the Philippines, that had a very direct learning exchange with Kathmandu, Nepal, about how to manage better seismic risk, for example. But the other lesson that we learn from this is, of course, that cities need support to understand their risks. And the cities that did a better job in terms of establishing and developing a risk profile that was multifaceted, it looked at climate, but it looked at other risks as well, were better able to manage the risks. And some of the cities that I might just mention are Greater Manchester here, for example, in the UK, which was one of the cities that very much enhanced its work around risk assessment and used it to develop a wider urban planning that was much more risk-informed. The partnership with the private sector became also quite important for building resilience and also longer-term approaches. So with this information, we pivoted to a new 10-year program of Making Cities Resilient, which is a coalition of 10 agencies, UN Habitat, World Bank, UNDRR, but also organizations that bring together cities such as ICLEI and C40 with an aim to help cities really undertake a resilience journey. And that journey is first and foremost based on having that understanding of risk. And what you were talking about in terms of bringing together the satellite data, but other types of information around vulnerability and around changing exposure patterns, demographic information, displacement, is extremely important for this. We know that climate risk interacts with other types of risks, and we've seen this obviously with the pandemic. So having this comprehensive approach to climate and disaster risk reduction for us is incredibly important. We have developed an online version of a disaster resilience scorecard, which is a qualitative approach, but it starts a conversation in cities. What do we know about the risks that we face, and where do we have important data gaps and information gaps that need to be filled? And I might just tell you about a couple of things we're doing. We have launched a program called GRAPH, which is a global risk assessment framework, which is an aggregation of existing risk data at the national level, but also an identification of information gaps, which is extremely important. So it's not only what we know, it's also what we do not know and where we can help fill those information gaps. And this is being rolled out in multiple countries right now. Bangladesh is an example. You've mentioned the Inform Index. So one of the things we're doing is help downscale Inform so that we can have more granular information to inform planning. And the other thing is that when we have aggregated these different data sets to help the partners translate this so that they can use the information, especially to inform planning processes. It may be national DRR strategies, but it could also be a local DRR strategy. So we need to downscale it further. But what we want to do is move away from risk-blind planning, which is unfortunately what we are still seeing in many contexts. DRR, resilience strategies, adaptation planning that is not really informed by a very good understanding of risk. So I would just maybe mention one more thing. I think there's some exciting initiatives that are going on right now that are really aiming to help, especially the SIDS and LDCs, get a better understanding of their risk. And here I would maybe just mention the work of the Insurance Development Forum with other partners, which has launched here at COP, the Global Risk Modeling Alliance, which is in partnership with the V20 countries, the vulnerable countries, which is about making modeling more accessible to countries that usually wouldn't have the means to model their risks. And that type of information is just incredibly valuable at the local level to inform planning processes. So this is a taste of what we're doing, and I'm eager to hear from the colleagues and back to our colleague at UN Habitat, perhaps on the the work that they're doing more in depth. So thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed, Loretta. That was extremely valuable contribution. And, you know, it's very interesting. You mentioned the insurance industry. To some extent, they're ahead of the curve on this in localizing this information, because one insures a building or a plot of land or a farm. The insurance is inherently local. And one of the problems, you mentioned national aggregation. That's good for a country to know, but it's not really actionable. To make it actionable, it has to be local. And that's what I think when we circle back to the final discussion, I think we can talk about, particularly in, it's the urbanization question, the rate of growth of cities and the risks that they're facing is something critical. So I'm going to go back to you, Fruzsina, just to complete your remarks. Welcome back. And just to maybe add on top of what you've heard, and how you're working through participatory planning and community involvement in cities and blending in this risk and data elements. Back to you.
Thank you, and apologies for my connection. But it's good to come back in here again, because in fact we are working hand in hand with the Making Cities Resilient campaign. And actually one thing we've been recently doing is trying to see how we could integrate the scorecard to start the discussions in our cities. But I will get back to my main points about city RAP and participatory planning and participatory prioritization. So there are a few reasons that I would like to highlight why these processes are so important. One is that participatory planning can identify and highlight gaps in municipal capacities and planning, especially in the most vulnerable and informal areas. So, for example, when we implemented City RAP in Lusaka, which was sort of where I was when we got disconnected, we were working in an informal neighborhood called Kanyama. And one of the activities of the City RAP tool is a municipal self-assessment, where all the different departments of the municipality ask themselves the same questions and rate their capacities. And the municipality in Lusaka took this assessment and then, as another activity of the City RAP process, presented it to the community leaders, community members, groups of women, youth, activists. And overall, Lusaka is a well-developed city, and the municipality's assessment was that they are doing generally pretty well in most areas. However, when they presented their outcomes to the Kanyama neighborhood representatives, they at first were enraged, and they said, no, in fact, this is not the case here, because these basic services are not provided in the same way. And, after some diplomatic negotiation and finessing, we were able to develop a dialogue where the municipality realized and the community realized that, in fact, the municipality is providing these services and performing well.
Yeah, we seem to.
And they were able.
We seem to have lost Loretta again. Let's just again give her a couple of seconds. Maybe.
It is. She keeps dropping out, so she needs to log in again. So it always takes a little moment for her.
Okay.
So there'll always be a little hiatus.
So maybe we'll wait for her to come back, so so she can complete her remarks. In that case, thank you. So while we wait for Loretta to come back, I think after she's finished, we're going to be going to Alpha Jallo, and I'm going to be asking you about the locale mechanism and a little bit about how then we can start to finance all of this. So for you to start to prepare yourself, because I think this, what we're going to need are financial mechanisms that enable us to translate this information and deploy it at the subnational level with money to deal with the kind of problems that Fruzsina is about to finish off talking about. Welcome back, Fruzsina.
Thank you. Apologies again. So let me just quickly try to wrap up. Participatory planning, the second point, is that it creates an enabling environment to perform climate action and ensure its sustainability, both in terms of generating political will in the municipality and also community ownership. Because when the communities and the municipalities are identifying the key issues and prioritizing them together, it also creates awareness and understanding. Not only does the municipality provide a drainage system in a certain neighborhood, but by involving the neighborhood and deciding where that drainage needs to be, they also create ownership about its maintenance, about its sustainability. My third point is that community involvement and joint planning can generate valuable data through simple activities like participatory mapping exercises and surveys. And this data adds a nuance to the information that the municipalities are able to use for their policies, for their decision-making, for their budgeting, for their investment decisions. Fourth, participatory planning helps to converge adaptation and mitigation, since adaptation responses at the local level can serve to supplement mitigative responses at the national level. Fifth, engaging communities in climate and resilience planning allows for a more holistic perspective, a resilience-based perspective, and contextualized, tailored, and scaled solutions, which is something that all the speakers have been discussing so far. And then finally, participatory planning can unlock financing. We've had cities where we had a resilience framework for action, and within weeks there was financing either from the national government or from donors or from investors to actually build, construct the resilient infrastructure that was prioritized by the community, or in some cases the community built the interventions themselves. We also have a $14 million project from the Adaptation Fund, in which we're actually executing the outcomes of the city RAP process in 4 cities in 4 countries. I also wanted to touch a little bit on the limitations of participatory planning, but I'm scared of being cut off, so maybe we'll come back to that and to the financing issue. But for now, I just wanted to put these few points forth. Thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed. And I appreciate the point where you ended, because this is the crux of the matter. You mentioned the Adaptation Fund and a $40 billion project. Of course, that is great. But as we all know, it takes at least a year to get something like that up and running, if not more. And so project by project by project, it's too late for that to be the solution. We need a way to systematically mechanistically, a global financing mechanism for local adaptation that can channel resources to the local level for verifiable, performance-based, high fiduciary control adaptation, but that's plugged into local planning and budgeting and local public financial management and local private sector as well, local private sector delivery. Fortunately, such a mechanism exists it's beyond a toddler. It's now maybe a 4 or 5 year old child. It's running around. It has 27 countries in it, and it has the potential to grow into that kind of thing that is needed in both urban and rural areas. And one of the countries which is implementing this mechanism is Gambia. Gambia has established a locale mechanism, an innovative financing mechanism that improves access to gender-responsive climate finance for local climate action in the Gambia. Can you please share some experiences and lessons learned? Mr. Alpha Jallo, who is the Director of the Climate Secretariat, Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Natural Resources from the Gambia.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and good afternoon all. It's a pleasure to be here. As we have said, I'm from the Gambia. I'm trying to share some of our experience with the local activities in the Gambia. But first, I'll come back to what you have said earlier, that the atmosphere is accumulating more energy than before. And that being the case, we know where it leads to. That is more climate disasters happening in our countries. And for example, in our country, this year, for the first time since history we started recording meteorological data. We had winds speed of 85 kilometers per hour and 75 kilometers per hour within 2 months. And then the destruction was huge in areas where local is even intervening. You go to a village, I think out of the houses, only 2 are standing, others have been blown up. And that shows you how vulnerable the country is, how we can make sure that adaptation reaches the local level, and as it has been, research has shown that only a fraction of climate finance reaches the local level. And now what we need to do, I think, is what local is trying to do and experiencing in the Gambia and also Malawi. Since 2019, local has been implementing activities in the Gambia through job, skills, and finance. And they have selected initially, they started with 5, and as they are growing, they scale up to 32. Now they are working with 32 ward development committees, targeting women and youths, and also ensuring that they own the system by involving in the designing of the activities. And how to do that is to do it through the government existing system, because we need sustainability and we need continuity. And to enhance local activities or initiative, is each local council, we ask them to develop a local development plan, and that will include climate integrated into their plans. And from there, local can pick up what the community needs in terms of their community development plans at what level, and build on those initiatives that the community has on climate change. And what Jobs also did in the Gambia is to allow finance at the local level, to allow them and encourage them to have, to create, to have businesses, bank accounts, and also have the culture of saving. If you want to if you want to strengthen capacity of individuals, you have to at least help them to have the culture of saving. That is more secured than what you have it today and you use it tomorrow. That is not secured. For continuity and for climate change adaptation, we need that culture of saving. Capacity is achieved through skills, and those skills are targeting where local infrastructure, climate smart agriculture, and ecosystem restoration. Instead of giving it to contractors outside, we use the local community themselves doing the job. In that, they will get the skills, they will get the capacity, and they will get the funds, and build their, and encourage youth and discourage youth migration, both within the urban area and also outside the country. And we found that with this initiative with local, it's a good initiative to ensure that climate finance reaches the local level, of which I think internationally all the organizations are calling for, that we should ensure that climate finance reaches the local level, who are most impacted by climate disasters. And in the Gambia, is that what we are trying to do. I think I will stop here until you have other questions, follow-up questions, then I can proceed.
Thank you so much indeed, Mr. Jallo. That was, I think, a really clear summary of what Local can do. And I'm just going to bring it all together now. Fortunately, we have another half an hour, and I'm looking forwards now to having a very interactive discussion where we can bring all these pieces together. So let's start to put the jigsaw together so we can make a picture. We heard from Mr. Alpha Jallo about the local climate adaptive living facility. This has 27 countries currently in it. Each country sits on the board. They govern the facility. It's governed by those countries. 14 ministers have signed the ministerial declaration requesting that it becomes one of the mechanisms for implementation of climate finance. It has been accepted by the least developed country group on the UNFCCC as a long-term measure for the LDCs, but it goes beyond those countries. Jamaica is a member in the Caribbean, Bhutan is a member in the Himalayas, Cambodia is a member in the Mekong Delta, Tuvalu is a member in the Pacific, Lesotho is a member in the mountains of Southern Africa, including Malawi in Central Africa, and of course we have Gambia here in West Africa too. And we actually had an application at one of the previous COPs from one of the US states, but unfortunately, given the way it's structured, we're not able to accept a US state as a member of Local. But certainly, you can see that there are, across almost all continents now, there are Local members. Now, the point about Local is it's a performance-based climate resilient grant with a verifiable methodology. The plugs into national systems. So you don't have to prepare a $40 million project for the Adaptation Fund that's a standalone project with its own management, its own governance, its own overheads, its own inefficiencies. Instead, you plug into existing country systems, implement through them, but with the fiduciary checks and with the climate additionality. So that's what we have in Locale. So it's an efficient mechanism for getting the money down to where it needs to be, urban or rural, because as we're hearing from the participants, all adaptation is rural. We have that. Then at the beginning, we heard from Dr. Einar Bjørgo about the satellite data. So we don't have that yet plugged into Locale, for example, systemically at scale. It needs to be. So, and that is extremely important, because if we can get that data in such a way to make it usable, then it can inform decision-making in Lesotho, in Tuvalu, in Jamaica, in Gambia, in Malawi, in a relevant way. And including through the cities that we heard UN Habitat as well. It can, those 31 cities that you've been working on so far, it can inform decision-making there. So we need to explore how we can bring that together so it's an effective plug-in to the decision-making financing process. And it's good to hear you've started to do that in some places, Solomon Islands and others. How can we take that to scale? And then we heard, of course, from Fruzsina about the cities. And it's good that we're in other forums, we're collaborating on the City Investment Facility, which will also bring investments to cities. Now, cities and rural areas are equally affected, and of course, there is now these huge peri-urban areas that are kind of half urban, half rural, and the growth of secondary cities in developing countries is huge. So that is an area that we need to look at, and we heard about the importance of participatory planning in those places too. So that has to be part of the equation, and of course, it can be. And then we heard from Loretta about the disaster element and the risk element. So again, I think you referred to it as the disaster, as the risk blind planning. That perhaps is still going on a little bit because people can extrapolate the climate, but the change is exponential, not incremental. So you can extrapolate, but it's not changing in a linear fashion, and it's quite difficult to calculate the risk. And the insurance industry is not sufficiently developed across the world to be able to do that. So we really need that risk element. And once you bring that in, it really helps to mobilize finance, because once you can show a risk reduction, that is something you can measure. You can measure risk reduction and you can bring finance in around that. So I think through the interventions, we can see the beginnings of a kind of ecosystem. With information, with risk reduction, covering urban and rural areas that can be deployed at scale with a mechanism that can bring financing down for the type of investments that are required. And these investments are many and varied, and again, they have to be carried out locally. We've heard throughout the COP of the type of things we're talking about. It's road retrofitting and strengthening, it's bridges, it's water storage, water management, drainage, irrigation, runoff management, it's urban management, it's land use planning, it's agriculture, it's new seeds. In one particular valley in Bhutan, in the Himalayas, the whole economy is based on the export of potatoes. And now potatoes don't grow anymore. Nobody will finance lentils. Lentils are growing, but there's no track record at the bank for lentils. How do you move from potatoes to lentils? That's the kind of transition, but that's only in that valley. Go down the hill to the city, and it's a different question, the type of thing that Loretta is dealing with. The type of thing that Fruzsina is dealing with. How do we deal with the neighborhood rehabilitation and the neighborhood adaptation that needs to take place in those cities as well? So that's very specific. One in the city, one in the rural area, just 15 kilometers apart. So that's the kind of scale that we need to get this financing mechanism. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions from the floor, including anybody who is watching online. And if there aren't any, then we'll have a second round from the panel where we can try to join these dots together. So would anybody like to ask a question relevant to this debate that we're having about how we can create consolidated mechanisms for local adaptation finance using information and risk reduction. Please.
Hello. So thank you very much for all those really interesting presentations. My name is Richard Jones. I'm from the Met Office Hadley Centre in the UK. I'm also the coordinating lead author of the Atlas chapter on the IPCC Working Group 1 report. So I've got a question mainly for Fruzsina, but also building on some of the points made by Einar and the Honourable Minister. I mean, what you're talking about in terms of this, the city RAP tool sounds really very interesting. And we've had a very similar experience because I've actually also been working in Lusaka, including in Kanyama and George townships. And I think that there's a bit of a missing element. I'm not sure whether there is, but I just want you to double check, because I'm just wondering where the science, where the data, where the research will come into the process that you're talking about, because the process that you talked about sounded very interesting, and certainly your experiences are very similar to ours, that the councillors, the local council, have some vision of what they're doing, and then the NGOs, they're sort of the local community people, have quite a different vision. You bring those together, and it really improves the understanding on both sides, and that can be very valuable. But then when you're talking about sort of building, upgrading infrastructure, I mean, I know that the drainage infrastructure in the informal settlements and the formal settlements across Lusaka is based on a Zambia Met Department report which analyses extreme rainfall in 1974. Now, as the Honourable Minister was talking about, and as Einar was talking about, these things have changed significantly since those data were analysed. So we really need to be bringing a research element into that process as well. And I'm just wondering whether you've got some ideas of how that might happen. And just sort of basically coming back to the question that was asked by the moderator, I mean, I think to have a really inclusive process, you really need to bring that in as well, because we are dealing with a situation where the climate is changing, has already changed. Recent past experience is very different from the 1970s and the 1980s. And also, as the Honourable Minister said, we need to be thinking about what's happening over the next 10 and 20 years. And so we need to be looking into the future to an extent as well, but that also needs to be brought in. And I'm just wondering how you think that can happen.
That's a brilliant question. So I'll go to Fruzsina first, and then I think Loretta and other panelists, and then maybe go back to the Minister, who might want to reflect on how at a policy level you can make these changes that were talked about, if that's possible. So Fruzsina, over to you. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you very much for the question and also for the suggestion, because I think it is both in one. And I absolutely agree that, in fact, all relevant partners, urban stakeholders need to be involved. And in the context of the City RAP tool, we do bring in the scientific community as well, because the scientific community needs to be a part of the conversation, and that data needs to also inform the decision-making at the municipal level and at the community level. And I think as well, where really the science and the data could also play a big role, is to offer the solutions. Because we need a mix, right? I mean, we need a mix of local solutions, local ideas, stemming from the communities themselves, stemming from the municipalities, but we also need partnerships. We need to figure out when we need to bring in outside ideas, best practices from other cities in the region, outside of the region, expertise coming from universities, from technical centers, from the scientific community, because upgrading, as you say, requires partnerships. So, you know, just going back to the process itself, there is a component of stock taking of all this data, and then adding on top of that the data collected from the consultations, from the participatory activities, and a consolidation of all of that. And the idea is that all of this integrates to then form, you know, what we call the resilience framework. So it's not just the data collected through the participatory process, but it is a consolidation of all of the data that could be gathered by the municipality. But of course, we need to coordinate better on a practical level to be able to identify, you know, who is collecting this data and involved. And this also requires capacity building and coordination. Of course, coordination between all of the key players, which is a challenge that we often face. So again, and thank you, and I would love to discuss more about how we could coordinate in the case of Lusaka as well.
Thank you so much indeed. So I'll go to the experts, and then I think bring in the colleagues from the countries themselves. So maybe Einar as well. I mean, you heard that evidence about 1974, the rainfall data, etc. Of course, that's not a basis on which to build flood drainage arrangements today. And you heard from Gambia about how even recently with this increased energy, they're getting wind speeds that were unheard of before. Any comment? I mean, yes, you have this satellite data. Is that relevant to trying to fix this problem? And again, maybe fixing it at scale, not case by case, but a way that entities can log in and update quickly this kind of baselines that they have. Any thoughts on that? And then I'll go to Loretta.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think from our side, what we are doing is also, for example, in this project we have in the Pacific, we collaborate with the UK Met Office, and they are able to provide climate forecasts for the countries. So that combined with, and I've also mentioned a lot of capacity development here, I think that's absolutely essential. So what we do as well is that we have, in these countries, we have one technical staff that is working very closely with the government, sitting with the government over time for 3 years and even longer. And we are able to, through that, develop really a good understanding of the needs. So it's not, I think sometimes the UN is too project-based. So we are there, we go in and we go out, we do a project and we finish and we go out again. I think it's important to stay in the countries. And that is what we have seen is working very well. We call it, because we are technicians, we call it technical backstopping, which sounds absolutely boring. But it's not that boring, because the countries themselves, the various ministries can then, through our in-country experts, can then ask for specific products, so that they don't necessarily have that capacity in the country, but then by doing it for them, we also teach them how to do it. So, and that is really down at the very practical level. So for example, for Fiji, we were asked to map a mangrove forest, and it was very easily done, but for them it made a huge difference. So I think by also combining, yes, the right information, the right baseline information that you need, with, of course, also a holistic view, and as also our colleague from Habitat said, having this in a coordinated manner, and having, again, there, if you have someone working with the government over time, you can ensure that coordination, making sure that we don't duplicate efforts, and we can build and we can share data together. I think that's really important.
No, thank you very much indeed. Loretta, any thoughts from you on the question?
Well, it's an excellent question, because key to the climate transition is investing in knowledge. And I think we're not paying enough attention to it. I think that everywhere we go with making cities resilient, but the other type of work that we're doing as well, we're being asked for help in helping these cities understand what the climate future is bringing to them. And they often don't have access to the climate downscaling. And sometimes it doesn't take very much to make a difference. And I could just use an example from Vietnam, from some colleagues who had a mapping in terms of vulnerability, and they knew that a typhoon was coming, and they knew the trajectory of the typhoon. So they were able to overlay the data to show where the typhoon was going to hit, but what was the vulnerability and exposure that was in that pathway of the typhoon. And so the government was better able to start the preparedness measures needed to allow for a better response. It didn't take very much, but it was hugely helpful. So I think that we need to be much more coordinated in our approaches to how we're supporting countries with data collection and analysis. And also just, there are some interesting partnerships that have been formed to deal with this problem. I'm thinking of the Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which is all about ensuring better risk information and analysis and data before you start to develop infrastructure plans. which I think is critically important. But there are others as well, and I think there is a real recognition that to go to scale, you need partnerships around data, and you need that investment in knowledge.
Thank you so much indeed. So thanks to the European Union, Sweden, Belgium, and many other partners, we are now able to roll out this financing mechanism locale, but it needs enriching. It needs this kind of information systematically brought into it. The Commonwealth Secretariat yesterday was very keen to push locale across the Commonwealth. But again, for it to be most effective, how can it plug in this kind of discussion we're having? So any thoughts from you, Mr. Alpha Jallo, on what you've heard and how it might be possible to somehow build that into your thinking, and what support you would need? I mean, I thought it was very interesting, your comment on the increased wind speed, and how it's noticeable that for the first time since measurements began, there is a significant change in the weather. So how would you react to this comment? I mean, I'm sure your baselines may also need to be updated. And so any thoughts from your side?
Thank you so much. To plant in the future and to plan for adaptation, you need data. And you need climate data, and climate data is supported by satellite data. With satellite data, it has improved our ability to forecast the daily weather forecast. It has reduced the myth that it is false, that only God knows tomorrow. Now, people have, especially the communities, believe that the forecast is something true, because what we are forecasting, the meteorological office, they have started observing exactly the same thing, and it is since years back. And we need the data to plan. And planning on the ground means how you can get money to the communities. And the access to that money is where sometimes it is challenging. And it's where I'm going to respond to your question. Direct access is one of those challenges. The procedure that are involved in getting funding, either bilateral or GCF, we all know the process is very cumbersome and complex. And to overcome that is to try to get direct access entities. And I think local initiative is a way of trying to assist to overcome that hurdle of direct access. We had, currently, we established a local climate change fund, and which we thought is an opportunity in the long run. That's also it will involve planning, 5 years, 10 years, to have it as an avenue of direct access. Plus, one of our institutions, we call it GAMWorks, is the government institution that are involved in construction, most of the construction that are going in the country, and it mobilizes billions of dollars. So we are looking at this institution also to have a direct access entity, so that to overcome the challenges of climate finance to the country. Thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed. So that's a very interesting point, and I know that Gambia is one of the countries that's taking the lead in establishing the institutional framework for climate finance at scale, moving away from the project approach, establishing a way in which they can access climate funds from any source, blend them in country, and deploy them effectively at the local level. So it's not all different parallel projects. So I think this way that you are working institutionally to create the institutional and the financial framework to enable Gambia to secure direct access to climate finance through mechanisms like the Locale mechanism, which is a standard that enables you to do that, is excellent. And hopefully from this discussion, you can see how once that framework is created, then this kind of information needs to be deployed through it, so that it's a one-stop shop for this data, the disaster risk elements, the urban elements, and bringing in the satellite data into the question, so that countries can have the climate finance ecosystem supplied by the relevant data, and then they can be masters of their own adaptation, rather than it's slicing and dicing it in many, many individual projects, each of which takes years to develop. And that's not going to solve the problem. So that's very interesting comments you made there, Mr. Jallo. Now I'd like to turn the floor back to our keynote speaker, Her Excellency Nancy Tembo, an Honourable Minister. I mean, you're a minister, so you, in a sense, sit there in the cabinet making these decisions. And from what you've heard so far, what do you think? You know, how has this discussion influenced your thinking on the challenges that Malawi faces? I know you have a really ambitious plan. I think it's for 2065 or something like that, for Malawi to become a upper middle income country. And so you're on that trajectory, but of course climate change is a huge burden and a barrier to reaching that standard that you have in your plan. How has this discussion influenced your thinking? Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's actually 2063.
Yes.
Target. I think what this discussion does, it enhances the need for partnerships and collaboration. We have departments that deal with climate change, and we've been receiving assistance from, for example, the UK Met, being able to upgrade our equipment to be able to be more, at least give out information that assists communities to prepare, that is most accurate. But we still need that assistance to be available, that capacity to be able to predict weather patterns at the local level. And so the data that is provided through satellite should be accessed even at that local level, so that capacity can help the communities to prepare. But the local mechanism is one of those mechanisms that can assist us get finance to build that capacity at local level. And as we were chatting here earlier on with the director of UNISAT, I asked him, what services can we get from you? And what he told me is training. They could offer us training opportunities. And that is something that we would take him on, because we need that capacity. We have staff that is well trained at the national level, but even there is gaps. We need that capacity at the local level. We need access to this data at the local level. This should not just be available, but it should lead to people like me to inform our decision making. So we appreciate what we've heard today. Just enhances the need for a collaboration, for partnerships, for countries such as Malawi and LDCs, where there is a capacity gap. It helps us to be able to make decisions using information that would be provided by satellite. So, yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Honourable Minister. Now, that's a very clear response, and I think I've really enjoyed this discussion so far, and I think that we are starting to build from it the outline of an enhanced ecosystem for locally led adaptation, for local finance, but informed through better data, urban and rural, and to make this systemic change that is needed. I think this has been a very interesting discussion so far, and fortunately, we have time for one more question or even one more clarification. Would anybody out there in internet land like to say anything, or anybody in the audience? Please, the floor is yours.
Yes. Hi, I'm Farhana from Malaysia. So I think in theme with data, there are some countries where data, especially on the national level, is private, where you have to pay for it to access it, especially like on a monthly or even yearly basis. So how does that work in terms of like transparency for, like, let's say, creating a more transparent and inclusive disaster risk data, like portfolio and everything? Like, how does that work? Or can you advise in other ways of like how to move beyond it, or should we work to or do you like sort of integrate both models together, a private and a more transparent model? Thanks.
That is an excellent point. Thank you very much indeed for that question. And it becomes even more relevant when you're looking at how, those who don't have access to financial resources but desperately need that data, how they can get access to that data. So I think I'm going to throw that question first to Dr. Einar and then to Loretta. Dr. Einar, is your data free? Can I access it if I want it? And is this an issue globally? I mean, do a lot of private companies, insurance companies, perhaps, hoard the data because it helps them design their insurance products, but they don't want anybody else to know the risk? And I'll ask a similar question, I think, to Loretta. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. What has happened in the last 5-6 years, I would say, is that a lot of satellite data are becoming available for free. So that is really encouraging, especially from the European Union. They have a whole range of satellites. Also, the Landsat satellites from the US have been available for free. So I think getting access to the data is now possible. There's also another interesting project or the tool that is available for free. You can get access to deforestation data, for example, based on a project financed by the government of Norway. This also should go for Malaysia. So there's many possibilities in order to, when I speak about satellite images. However, as you may know, is that you need to have this provided to you in, as the minister said, in a way that you can use it and take informed decisions on it. And that's, sorry to say, but that's not a satellite image. You have to combine it with other types of data, other types of information, so that the decision makers, as well as the technicians can maybe deal with the satellite data, but for taking informed decisions, you need to have it really into products with very clear recommendations based on the science-based information that you can get from the imagery.
Thank you very much indeed. This is great. So I think, Loretta, in maybe 1 minute, or 45 seconds to 1 minute, any thoughts on the financial side of the data, the fund?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, open source data is obviously what we're aiming for. And there is this collaboration I've been talking about with the insurance sector. And they have launched here the Global Resilience Index, which is a compilation of data that emanates from the insurance sector as well as public sector as well. But one thing I would say is that in many countries, it's not the availability of data, it's the fact that people are not aware that the data exists. And so they don't even know where to go to get the data that may be available to them. And so I think it is a question of also coordinating and helping countries and cities know where to access data that is available, that is not proprietary, but is actually openly available. And then, as you've rightly said, how to use that data. I think that's a really important gap that we need to focus on. So it's not just the supply side that's the problem, it's the usage of it. One thing I would maybe just like to mention is that I think the UN is recognizing this data issue as an increasingly important gap. And UNDR, along with the World Meteorological Organization, has just launched a Center of Excellence on Disaster and Climate Resilience, which will bring on other UN agencies as well, with the real aim to improving the data, including the forecasting, which we've mentioned on this panel is such a problem. So there are a lot of steps in this direction.
Thank you so much indeed, Loretta, and we're almost out of time, but I think this was a great question to finish and to kind of summarize then. Hopefully, once countries join the local climate adaptive living facility and we build this alliance, they can also get access to this data because we can facilitate that financially through this consolidated work. So I think this has been a great panel. It's one world, it's one United Nations, it's one partnership, I mean, it's one family, and really we're doing this, for me, it's, if we don't get this right, our descendants will never forgive us. So it's very, very important, and this is a critical discussion. Thank you all very much indeed for being here. And back to, I don't know, back to the IT, or back to the thank you.